By December 1944, the war in Western Europe appeared to be settling into a predictable pattern. The front lines looked stable, German strength looked spent, and Allied planning reflected a belief that the remaining dangers were known, measured, and manageable. This channel examines World War II through the moments when assumptions hardened, decisions narrowed, and history moved forward with fewer options than anyone expected. If you're new here, consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. By the autumn of 1944, Allied command in Western Europe was operating under a conclusion that felt not only reasonable, but settled. Germany, it was believed, had reached the limits of what it could still do. The question was no longer whether the enemy could alter the course of the war, but how quickly the remaining resistance could be compressed and eliminated. This certainty had been earned, not assumed. Since June 1944, the German army in the West had suffered catastrophic losses. The Normandy campaign had destroyed much of its experienced armored strength. The retreat across France had been chaotic and costly. Paris had been liberated in August. Brussels followed in early September. Antwerp's port fell largely intact. By October 1944, Allied forces stood along a continuous front from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Measured in territory, the war appeared decisively tilted. Measured in numbers, the imbalance was overwhelming. German casualty figures since the summer ran into the hundreds of thousands. Entire divisions had been erased from order of battle charts. Replacement quality had declined sharply. Fuel shortages were chronic and worsening. Allied air power controlled daylight movement so thoroughly that German columns were forced onto roads only at night, fragmenting coordination and slowing redeployment. Intelligence summaries reflected this reality. By October and November 1944, Allied assessments increasingly described German forces as defensive, exhausted, and incapable of sustained offensive action. Counterattacks were expected to be local and short-lived, designed to slow Allied momentum rather than reverse it. Strategic initiative, in every estimate that mattered, belonged to the Allies. This belief shaped the entire structure of planning. Operational discussions focused on how best to apply pressure, not where pressure might unexpectedly be applied against them. Staff conferences revolved around logistics, fuel allocation, replacement flows, bridge repair, winter clothing, and the sequencing of future offensives toward the Rhine. The war was understood as a problem of throughput and endurance, not surprise. Even disagreement operated inside this framework. Commanders argued about priorities, not possibilities. Some advocated deeper thrusts toward the Ruhr. Others urged consolidation and supply buildup. But no serious planning assumed that Germany retained the ability to seize the initiative on a strategic scale in the West. The idea itself had become unnecessary. Terrain reinforced this confidence. The Ardennes region of eastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg had long been classified as unsuitable for major mechanized operations. Dense forests, narrow roads, steep river valleys, and unpredictable winter weather made it an unlikely axis for decisive movement. In Allied planning documents, the sector was treated as quiet by design. By November 1944, divisions rotated into the Ardennes not to prepare for combat, but to recover from it. Units depleted by months of fighting were sent there to refit. Newly arrived formations were introduced to the front in a sector considered safe. The region functioned as a buffer, a place where time could be spent without risk. This was not an oversight. It was a conclusion drawn from experience. German attempts at counteroffensive action earlier in the year had failed quickly and visibly. Fuel constraints alone appeared to rule out sustained armored operations. Allied air superiority seemed absolute. The German rail network was heavily damaged. Production was under constant bombardment. Taken together, these factors formed a coherent picture. Germany no longer possessed the freedom to choose its battles. By late November 1944, that picture had hardened into institutional certainty. Leave schedules were approved. Christmas planning entered staff discussions. Maps remained pinned in familiar configurations. The front was understood not as fragile, but as fixed. Movement would continue eastward, at a pace dictated by logistics rather than resistance. Yet inside this confidence lay a quiet tension. German units were withdrawing from the line in ways that did not fully align with collapse. Panzer divisions were disappearing from contact without evidence of destruction. They were not being identified in the east. They were not reappearing in defensive positions along the Rhine. In some sectors, German radio traffic dropped sharply, creating gaps in signals intelligence rather than spikes. These observations appeared in reports, but they did not disrupt the prevailing model. Attrition explained much. Reorganization explained the rest. A defeated army, it was assumed, naturally consolidated its remaining strength. There was no obvious reason to believe these movements pointed toward anything more ambitious than delaying actions or localized counterstrokes. More importantly, the existing framework did not require an alternative explanation. Once an institution accepts that the enemy is strategically exhausted, new information is interpreted through that assumption. Evidence that fits is absorbed. Evidence that does not is softened, deferred, or explained away. In late 1944, Allied intelligence was not blind. It was selective, guided by conclusions already reached. This selectivity extended beyond intelligence into posture. Reserves were positioned with an emphasis on offensive exploitation, not emergency response. Supply routes were optimized for eastward movement. Winter preparations focused on sustaining momentum rather than absorbing shock. The system was designed for continuation, not rupture. By early December 1944, Allied command in Western Europe was operating inside a closed loop of expectation. The enemy would react. The Allies would press. Time would continue to work in their favor. The war's remaining dangers were assumed to be known, measured, and diminishing. What was no longer actively considered was the possibility that Germany, under pressure and near collapse, might choose to gamble everything on a single, concentrated blow, not as a path to victory, but as an attempt to break the structure of Allied assumptions themselves. That possibility did not yet feel urgent. It did not yet demand action. It existed only at the edges of reports, in details that felt administrative rather than decisive. But wars rarely announce the moment when assumptions expire. They only reveal it when events begin to move faster than planning allows. By the first weeks of December 1944, the Allied war effort in the West had settled into a rhythm built on confidence, continuity, and expectation. The front appeared quiet. The system appeared stable. And the space for surprise was already narrowing. The clock, though few recognized it yet, was running. By late October 1944, the Allied assumption of German exhaustion had become operational fact. It shaped troop placements, supply priorities, and expectations about what the winter would bring. But assumptions, no matter how widely shared, still depend on interpretation. And interpretation depends on who is willing to question what the data actually shows. At 3rd Army Headquarters, that task fell to Oskar Koch. Koch was not a field commander, and he did not command attention through rank or personality. He worked through summaries, intercepts, order of battle charts, and pattern comparison. His job was not to predict what the enemy wanted to do, but to identify what the enemy was physically capable of doing, based on movement, logistics, and force structure. By November 1944, Koch began to notice a discrepancy that did not fit the prevailing model. German armored divisions were leaving the line. This, by itself, was not unusual. Units rotated. Formations were pulled back to refit. But the destinations were unclear. Panzer divisions were not being confirmed in the east, where German forces were under enormous pressure from the Soviet advance. Nor were they appearing in defensive depth along the Rhine in numbers consistent with a final stand. They were simply vanishing from immediate contact. At the same time, German radio traffic in certain sectors dropped sharply. Signals intelligence did not record frantic communication or chaotic movement. Instead, there were gaps. Silence. In some cases, entire formations went quiet. According to standard Allied interpretation, this could mean several things: degraded communications, loss of equipment, or reorganization after defeat. But Koch noticed what it did not mean. It did not look like collapse. In previous German withdrawals, especially earlier in France, retreat had been noisy. Units under pressure transmitted constantly. Requests for fuel, ammunition, and guidance spiked. Command nets lit up as formations tried to disengage without disintegrating. This was different. The silence suggested control. Koch began to overlay these observations with other data points. Rail movement reports. Fuel consumption estimates. Replacement flows. The picture that emerged was not of an army dissolving, but of one deliberately pulling pieces off the board. Most striking was where those pieces were not going. If Germany intended only to delay Allied advances, logic dictated reinforcement of the Rhine defenses or shoring up threatened sectors in the east. Yet the available evidence did not support either conclusion. Armored strength was being preserved, not expended. In intelligence summaries prepared in November 1944, Koch raised a possibility that ran against institutional momentum. Germany might be preparing a concentrated counteroffensive in the West. Not a local spoiling attack. Not a temporary disruption. A major operation. This interpretation did not align easily with Allied expectations. It required accepting that Germany, despite fuel shortages, air inferiority, and manpower losses, still possessed enough organizational coherence to mass forces secretly and strike at a time of its choosing. It also required identifying where such an attack could occur. Koch's assessment pointed toward the Ardennes. From an Allied perspective, the region's very unsuitability for large-scale operations made it attractive. Thinly held sectors. Resting divisions. Limited reserves nearby. Poor weather that could restrict Allied air power. Roads that, while narrow, funneled movement toward operationally significant objectives. The logic was uncomfortable because it was plausible. Koch did not present this as certainty. Intelligence rarely allows that. Instead, he framed it as risk, a low-probability event with high consequences. The kind of scenario that planning systems often discount because it does not fit prevailing trends. He took his analysis directly to George S. Patton. Patton's reputation within the Allied command was complex. He was known for aggression, speed, and relentless offensive pressure. But within his own headquarters, he also cultivated a culture of preparation and contingency. Staff officers were expected to think beyond their assigned missions, to imagine disruption rather than assume continuity. When Koch laid out his assessment, Patton did not dismiss it. According to staff recollections, Patton asked questions that focused less on German intent and more on German capability. How many divisions could realistically be concentrated? How much fuel would be required? How long could such an operation be sustained? What weather conditions would be necessary to mask movement? These were not rhetorical questions. They were logistical ones. Koch's answers were cautious, but the implications were clear. A German offensive would be risky, but not impossible. It would rely on surprise, weather, and speed. And if it succeeded in breaking through thin Allied lines, the consequences would extend far beyond the initial sector. Patton did not immediately challenge higher Allied assessments. He did not broadcast alarm. There was no visible shift in posture. Instead, he internalized the risk. This distinction mattered. In large institutions, intelligence that contradicts consensus often fails not because it is wrong, but because it demands costly action before certainty exists. To react openly would require repositioning forces, rewriting plans, and justifying disruption based on an assessment most senior commanders did not share. Patton chose a different path. If the warning could not yet be acted upon publicly, it could still be prepared for privately. By late November 1944, Third Army headquarters began quietly examining a scenario that was not part of their official mission. What if the Germans attacked through the Ardennes? What if the main effort came from the north, not the east? What if the war did not continue along its expected axis? This was not yet a plan. It was a question. And once the question existed, it refused to disappear. The Allied system as a whole still believed the enemy was exhausted. That belief remained intact. But inside Third Army, a parallel line of thinking had begun to form, one that did not assume continuity, and did not rely on reaction alone. The warning signs were incomplete. The evidence was circumstantial. But the cost of being wrong in one direction was far greater than the cost of being wrong in the other. By early December 1944, the intelligence picture in the West contained two competing realities. One was visible, comfortable, and widely accepted. The other was quieter, harder to prove, and increasingly difficult to ignore. Only one of them would survive contact with events. And when it did, the time for interpretation would already be over. By early December 1944, the Allied war effort in Western Europe continued to move along the path it had defined for itself months earlier. Official plans remained unchanged. Third Army's mission was fixed: continue pressure eastward toward the Saar, maintain contact, and prepare for further advances once logistics allowed. On paper, nothing had shifted. But inside Third Army headquarters, a second layer of planning was taking shape, one that could not be acknowledged, briefed openly, or requested through formal channels. It began with a constraint. Patton's orders were explicit. His army was committed east. Fuel allocations, ammunition deliveries, and road priorities were all calculated around that axis of advance. Any deviation would require approval from higher command, justification through intelligence channels, and acceptance of risk by an Allied leadership that did not yet share his concern. Waiting for that process meant waiting for confirmation. And confirmation, in this case, would arrive only after the enemy moved. Patton understood the asymmetry immediately. If Koch was wrong, preparation would cost little more than staff time and paper. If Koch was right, and Third Army had not prepared, the delay imposed by formal replanning would be measured in days, days the Allies would not have. So Patton acted without asking permission. According to staff records and later recollections, he ordered his planners to develop a full contingency for an event that officially did not exist, a sudden German offensive through the Ardennes requiring Third Army to disengage from the Saar and pivot north. This was not a sketch. It was not a hypothetical discussion. It was a complete operational solution. The problem was formidable. Third Army was not a compact force. By December 1944, it consisted of multiple corps spread across a wide frontage, supported by hundreds of thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, and supply units. Turning such a formation 90 degrees, in winter, under combat conditions, would normally require weeks of preparation and coordination. Patton demanded it be executable in days. The staff work that followed focused not on intent, but on mechanics. Routes were identified first. Road networks capable of supporting heavy traffic were mapped and prioritized. Bottlenecks were marked. Alternate crossings were listed. Engineers assessed bridges that could bear sustained armored movement. Fuel planning followed. Estimates were made for how much gasoline would be required not for attack, but for redeployment, a costly distinction. Dumps were identified. Allocation tables were rewritten quietly. Margins were shaved wherever possible. Ammunition posed its own challenge. Artillery units required forward resupply even while moving. Schedules were adjusted so that stocks could be carried, not just delivered. Units were instructed, without explanation, to maintain readiness levels higher than normally required for a supposedly quiet period. Traffic control became a central concern. Movement tables were prepared down to the hour. Corps and division march columns were sequenced to avoid gridlock. Military police units were assigned roles that would only make sense if an emergency redeployment occurred. None of this appeared in official orders. To outside observers, Third Army looked like any other formation preparing for winter operations. Training continued. Routine reports were filed. The eastward attack remained the formal priority. But inside headquarters, a switch had been wired. Patton understood something his critics often missed: speed is not created in the moment of decision. It is created beforehand, through preparation that appears unnecessary until it is not. By December 10, 1944, the contingency plan existed in executable form. If ordered, Third Army could halt its eastward attack, disengage, pivot north, and begin moving toward the Ardennes with minimal delay. Corps commanders would not need new concepts. They would receive new directions that fit into work already done. This was the difference between planning and prediction. Patton did not know the Germans would attack. He did not need to. He only needed to know that if they did, time would be the decisive variable. The wider Allied command structure remained unaware of the depth of this preparation. At high headquarters, discussions continued to revolve around sustaining pressure, managing supply constraints, and coordinating future operations toward the Rhine. Intelligence estimates still framed German action as defensive and reactive. There was no appetite for disrupting the operational rhythm based on a scenario that had not yet occurred. This gap between preparation and permission mattered. Large organizations move deliberately for good reason. They rely on consensus, verification, and layered authority to avoid catastrophic error. But those same mechanisms impose delay. In moments of rupture, delay becomes its own form of risk. Patton chose to absorb that risk personally. He did not announce his contingency. He did not challenge Allied consensus in public. He simply ensured that if the moment arrived, Third Army would not need to think. It would move. By mid-December 1944, two wars were effectively being planned in Western Europe. One was visible, formal, and continuous, a steady advance eastward against an enemy believed to be nearly finished. The other existed only inside a single headquarters, a response to a future that official doctrine did not yet recognize. Both plans assumed time was available. Only one accounted for what would happen when it was not. The choice had already been made. The question was when it would be tested. The German attack began in the early hours of December 16, 1944. It did not announce itself with clarity. There was no single moment that confirmed the scale of what was unfolding. Reports arrived unevenly, filtered through fog, snow, and disrupted communications. At first, it looked like what Allied planners had long expected: localized pressure against a thinly held sector. Then the reports continued. Infantry units in the Ardennes were pushed back. Road junctions changed hands. Artillery fire increased in areas previously considered quiet. Communications frayed. By mid-morning, the pattern no longer fit a limited probe. This was not a defensive reaction. It was an offensive. German forces had struck through the Ardennes with concentrated armor and infantry, exploiting poor weather that grounded much of Allied air power. Snow and low cloud cover neutralized one of the Allies' greatest advantages. Units stationed in the sector for rest and refit were suddenly engaged in full-scale combat. The assumption that had governed Allied planning for months fractured under pressure. By the afternoon of December 16, it was clear that the German attack was not local. It was deepening, widening, and accelerating. The front line bent inward. Gaps appeared. Units that had expected a quiet winter found themselves under sustained assault. At Allied headquarters, the reaction followed a familiar pattern. Initial disbelief gave way to recalculation. Intelligence staffs revised estimates. Commanders requested clarification, then reinforcement. Maps were updated repeatedly as positions changed faster than reports could keep pace. The model had not anticipated this scenario. It had to be rebuilt in real time. The Ardennes, long treated as a buffer, had become the center of gravity. By December 17, German armored columns were advancing westward toward key road hubs. Their objective was no longer ambiguous. If they could reach the Meuse River and seize the crossings beyond it, they could split the Allied front, disrupt logistics, and force a pause that Germany desperately needed. The attack did not promise victory. It promised leverage. That distinction mattered. At Supreme Headquarters, the scale of the crisis began to register fully. Dwight D. Eisenhower, faced with fragmentary reports and a rapidly shifting front, moved to stabilize the situation. Reserves were discussed. Units were redirected. Emergency conferences were convened. The problem was time. Every option available required movement. Every movement required coordination. And coordination, in winter conditions across already strained roads, imposed delay. It was in this context that Eisenhower contacted George S. Patton. The question was direct and practical. How quickly could Third Army disengage from its current operations and move north to counter the German thrust? For most commanders, this would have been an unanswerable question in the moment. It would require staff consultation, recalculation, and cautious estimates shaped by uncertainty. Patton did not pause. According to multiple post-war accounts, he responded with a time frame measured not in weeks, but in days. He did not present it as aspiration. He presented it as fact. What made this exchange decisive was not confidence, but preparation. When the call ended, Patton did not convene a planning conference. He did not ask for options. He reached for a plan that already existed. He contacted his headquarters and issued a brief instruction, a prearranged signal that required no explanation. Play ball. Within hours, Third Army began executing the contingency that had been prepared weeks earlier. Eastward operations slowed, then halted. Units disengaged according to schedules already written. Traffic control points were activated. March tables were issued. Military police moved into positions designated long before the emergency existed. The scale of the movement was immense. Approximately 133,000 men, supported by thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, and supply convoys, began pivoting north. Corps that had been oriented toward the Saar reoriented toward Bastogne and the surrounding road network. Divisions shifted axes. Engineers worked to keep routes open despite snow and ice. This was not improvisation. It was execution under pressure. The weather that had aided the German advance now complicated Allied response. Snowstorms reduced visibility. Roads iced over. Vehicles broke down. Traffic jams threatened to paralyze movement. Yet the pre-planned sequencing allowed Third Army to maintain momentum. Units moved when they were told, where they were told, along routes already reconnoitered. By December 19, elements of Third Army were in position to strike northward. By December 22, they were engaged in combat, pushing toward Bastogne to relieve encircled American forces. What mattered most was not speed alone, but coherence. The German plan relied on dislocation, on the belief that Allied command structures would struggle to respond quickly to an unexpected axis of attack. Delay was the weapon. Confusion was the multiplier. Patton's preparation neutralized both. Third Army's movement did not eliminate the crisis. Fighting remained intense. Losses mounted. Progress was slow and costly. But the German timetable collapsed. The window for reaching the Meuse narrowed, then closed. The offensive lost momentum not because it lacked courage or firepower, but because it ran out of time. By the end of December 1944, the German advance had stalled. Weather improved. Allied air power returned. Reserves solidified the front. The bulge that had threatened to rupture the Allied line began to recede. In the immediate aftermath, the focus turned to battle narratives, heroism at Bastogne, desperate defenses, fierce winter fighting. These stories were real, and they mattered. But beneath them lay a quieter truth. The decisive moment of the Battle of the Bulge did not occur on December 16, or December 19, or December 26. It occurred weeks earlier, when a warning that could not yet be proven was treated as worth preparing for anyway. When the model broke, one system had already moved past it. From that point on, the war moved in only one direction. By late December 1944, the immediate crisis of the German offensive had passed its peak. The advance had stalled short of its operational objectives. The Meuse remained out of reach. The Allied front, bent but unbroken, had stabilized under pressure. What followed was not a dramatic reversal, but a slow compression. German forces continued to fight hard, particularly around Bastogne and along the shoulders of the salient. But the momentum that had defined the first days of the offensive was gone. Fuel shortages worsened. Roads clogged with damaged vehicles. Units that had advanced rapidly now found themselves exposed, short on supplies, and increasingly vulnerable to Allied air power as the weather cleared. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was no longer a question of whether the German attack would succeed, but how much damage it would inflict before it was fully rolled back. In post-war accounts, this phase is often treated as inevitable, as if the German failure was always assured. But inevitability, in this case, was manufactured. It was created by preparation. The German plan had been built around a narrow window. Speed was essential. Surprise was decisive. The weather had to cooperate. Allied reaction had to be slow. Every assumption depended on time behaving in a specific way. Patton's intervention disrupted that timing. Third Army's pivot did not destroy German forces outright. It did something more damaging: it denied them freedom of movement. By striking the southern flank of the German advance, Patton forced German commanders to divert units, slow their push westward, and commit resources defensively earlier than planned. According to post-war German analyses, this loss of tempo proved fatal. Armored spearheads that were supposed to drive relentlessly toward the Meuse became entangled in battles they had not budgeted time or fuel for. Reserves intended for exploitation were pulled into holding actions. The offensive's internal logic began to unravel. This mattered because the German plan had no margin. Fuel allocations had been calculated to the limit. Any delay increased the risk of immobilization. Supply columns were already strained by Allied interdiction and winter conditions. Once the offensive slowed, recovery became impossible. From an Allied perspective, the contrast between preparation and reaction became clearer with each passing day. Other formations had to improvise under fire. Orders were revised repeatedly. Units arrived piecemeal. Commanders learned the shape of the battle as they fought it. This was not incompetence. It was the natural result of responding to an event that planning had not fully anticipated. Third Army, by contrast, behaved differently. Movements followed pre-arranged schedules. Corps boundaries shifted without confusion. Logistics adapted quickly because the problem had already been defined. Even when conditions deteriorated, the underlying system held. Historians later noted that this difference was not about brilliance in the moment. It was about friction. Every large military operation generates friction: delays, misunderstandings, mechanical failures, human limits. Preparation does not eliminate friction. It absorbs it. The more that can be decided before pressure arrives, the less decision-making must occur when time is scarce. Patton's contingency planning did exactly that. It converted uncertainty into procedure. This did not make the fighting easier. Third Army suffered significant casualties during its advance north. Units moved and fought in brutal winter conditions. Progress was slow, contested, and costly. There was no clean breakthrough, no dramatic collapse of German resistance. But the German offensive was now boxed in. By early January 1945, Allied counterattacks from north and south began to squeeze the salient. German units withdrew under pressure, often abandoning equipment they could not fuel or repair. The initiative, briefly seized, slipped away for the final time in the West. In the weeks that followed, after action reports and staff histories began to reassess what had happened, the Battle of the Bulge was no longer described simply as a surprise. It was examined as a failure of assumptions. The belief that Germany could no longer mount a strategic offensive had shaped posture, deployment, and readiness. When that belief proved wrong, the cost was immediate and measurable. But the reassessment also highlighted an exception. Patton's response did not emerge spontaneously on December 16. It was the product of weeks of quiet preparation based on incomplete but unsettling intelligence. The plan existed not because it was certain to be needed, but because the consequences of not having it were unacceptable. This distinction reshaped how the battle was understood. Victory was not the result of a single decision or a dramatic moment. It was the outcome of a system that had preserved optionality when others had closed it off. Where Allied planning as a whole had narrowed its expectations, Third Army had quietly kept a door open. By the time the door needed to be used, it was the only one left. The broader Allied war effort would soon resume its eastward advance. The Rhine would be crossed. Germany would collapse in the spring. In hindsight, the Ardennes offensive would appear as a final, desperate gamble, dangerous, costly, but ultimately futile. What made it futile was not inevitability. It was preparation applied at the right moment. And once that moment passed, Germany no longer had another. The remaining choices were already gone. By January 1945, the shape of the war in Western Europe had been irrevocably altered. The German offensive in the Ardennes had failed, not in a sudden collapse, but through exhaustion, delay, and the steady loss of options. The bulge in the Allied line was reduced day by day until it ceased to exist as a strategic problem. In operational terms, the outcome was clear. Germany had expended its last meaningful reserves in the West. Armored formations that could not be replaced were destroyed or rendered immobile. Fuel stocks that had taken months to accumulate were gone. The Luftwaffe, briefly committed in support, suffered losses it could not recover from. But the deeper consequence lay elsewhere. The Battle of the Bulge forced a reckoning with how modern wars are decided, not only by strength, but by assumptions. Before December 1944, Allied planning had been governed by a belief in German exhaustion so complete that it reshaped posture, deployment, and imagination. That belief was not irrational. It was grounded in data, trend analysis, and recent success. Yet it had closed off a category of thought, the possibility that a weakening enemy might still choose to gamble. Post-war analysis repeatedly returned to this point. German planners understood that their offensive could not win the war. What it could do, they believed, was fracture Allied coordination, impose delay, and create political leverage. The operation was conceived not as a path to victory, but as an attempt to reopen choices that had already narrowed. That Germany failed does not negate the logic. It exposes the risk inherent in assuming that decline produces predictability. On the Allied side, the battle became a case study in asymmetry between planning systems. Most of the Allied command structure responded competently once the attack was recognized. Reserves were shifted. Air power was brought to bear when weather allowed. The front stabilized and then reversed. These actions mattered. But they occurred inside time constraints imposed by surprise. The exception was George S. Patton's Third Army. What distinguished Patton's role was not aggression or instinct, but timing. His decision-making advantage did not originate on December 16, but weeks earlier, when a warning that lacked institutional support was still treated as actionable. This mattered because large systems rarely fail due to lack of intelligence. They fail because they commit too early to a single interpretation of that intelligence. Once an assumption becomes structural, embedded in deployment, logistics, and scheduling, reversing it becomes expensive. Not just materially, but psychologically. It requires admitting that certainty was premature. Patton did not overturn Allied doctrine. He did not persuade higher command to revise its estimates in advance. He did something quieter, he preserved optionality inside his own command. This approach did not depend on being right. It depended on refusing to be cornered by certainty. In the years after the war, military historians and planners would return to the Ardennes not for lessons about winter fighting or armored tactics, but for insights into decision-making under uncertainty. Staff colleges examined how intelligence was weighed, how assumptions formed, and how organizations reacted when models failed. The conclusion was uncomfortable but consistent. The most dangerous moment in a campaign is often not when the enemy is strongest, but when he is believed to be finished. At that point, vigilance declines. Alternatives disappear. Systems optimize for efficiency rather than resilience. Surprise regains its power. The Battle of the Bulge did not change the outcome of the war. Germany still fell in May 1945. The Allied advance resumed. The end was no longer in doubt. But the battle reshaped how that end was reached. It delayed operations. It cost lives. It exposed vulnerabilities that confidence had obscured. And it demonstrated that preparation, not reaction, determines who controls time when assumptions collapse. Patton's contingency plan did not guarantee success. It guaranteed readiness. That distinction is easy to miss in hindsight, when outcomes appear inevitable. But inevitability is often constructed backward, after the fact, from decisions that were anything but obvious when they were made. In December 1944, the war briefly reopened possibilities that Allied planners believed had already closed. One system was forced to adapt in real time. Another had already adapted in advance. History tends to remember the movement of armies, the clash of units, the drama of encirclement and relief. Less visible is the moment when a plan that was never supposed to be used quietly becomes decisive. What the Battle of the Bulge ultimately revealed was not just the danger of underestimating a desperate enemy, but the cost of believing that uncertainty has been eliminated. By the time reality breaks a model, the model has already done its damage. The war did not end in the Ardennes. But the final illusion about how it could still change was buried there, under snow, stalled columns, and plans that arrived too late to matter. If you've made it this far, you understand that history isn't decided in a single moment. It's shaped by timing, hesitation, and the decisions people make when options begin to close. If this perspective speaks to you, consider subscribing for future episodes. As the war itself would prove, once events are set in motion, they rarely wait for permission.